Sure, my name is Peter T. Alter. I am a curator at the Chicago History Museum. I've been here about 10 years. I started as a public historian, which was a very kind of loosey-goosey title where we were doing a lot of research based in recent immigrant communities and things like oral histories and gathering artifacts for our collection. We have kind of two primary points on which we focus. The first is exhibits, first and foremost, really. When you entered the building off Clark Street through the public entrance, you walked into a lobby that's a very, very loosely abstract streetscape that includes a lowrider car in the middle. That is an example of an exhibit on which I worked. I was the curator for that exhibit. And something like the lowrider, which sits there in the middle of the lobby, itself its own project. I contacted various local lowrider clubs. We worked with one particular lowrider club called Amistad in Cicero, western suburb, and that was a very lengthy, long process of creating an authentic lowrider, at least authentic by the definition that Amistad kind of laid out for us. Another example of what a curator does when working on exhibits. Currently, I'm working with another curator on an exhibit called Facing Freedom, which opens this summer. It's a semi-permanent installation like the lobby, probably even longer term than the lobby. And that piece is a U.S. history exhibit focusing on the ideas of conflicts over freedom. One of the stories I'm focusing on is the Japanese internment that took place during World War II. That, for example, is reaching out to the local Chicago Japanese American Historical Society. So we're working with them to do oral histories, to borrow artifacts to document the internment. And so then, in terms of the exhibit, I am selecting artifacts, writing labels, working with our interactive manager to develop interactives for that kind of thing. So it's a whole host of things. I talk to the media. I've been on all of the local networks. And certainly I'm not any exception, as have all my colleagues in the curatorial unit. When the White Sox won the World Series, very much related to sort of the collecting angle of what curators do here. I walked very large parts of the parade route. I think I ended up walking like 6 miles that day, collecting various things from the parade route. What that relates to is collecting materials related either to things going on at the moment, or things that are sometimes passing away. So it's a lot of different things, a lot of things that I didn't ever expect that I would be doing. Well, I have a PhD. That's my terminal degree. I have a bachelor's degree in history, a BA from Wabash College in Indiana, a master's degree in U.S. history and Eastern European history from the University of Washington in Seattle. My PhD is from the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona, and there I studied U.S. history and Balkan history. What kind of led me to this path were a couple of different things. What I studied in terms of those two kind of at least geographically disparate areas was immigration from southeastern Europe to the United States. A lot of my research was done across the hall from where we're sitting actually in both directions in the research library, what ultimately became the research library at the Chicago History Museum. So I was familiar with this place. I always assumed I would be a college professor at some four-year college. By the time when I was finishing up in the late 1990s, there was a glut on the market. I think to some extent maybe there's still a glut on the market of new, especially U.S. history PhDs. And I also think that probably I was funneled by different routes probably into a good position, because I don't think, although I still teach quite a bit, I don't think ultimately I probably would have been the best academic scholar. I freely obviously admit that. So I was applying for lots of jobs and getting rejection letters as fast as I could fill out applications, which is not unusual for anyone, especially these days. And this was the one job here at the then Chicago Historical Society for the public history job, for the public historian job. And this was very much kind of right time, right place. I was studying immigration. That was really kind of the focus. And they were starting up a recent immigration documentation project. So I understood kind of the overall arc of the story of immigration to the United States and really kind of internationally as well. Was not that familiar with some of the more recent post-World War II groups that I would eventually study through the documentation project, but got to know those groups and really got to realize that working in a place like the Chicago History Museum, you don't get to focus on one thing, you get to focus on a lot of different things. So maybe your depth of knowledge isn't that great, but your breadth of knowledge is very great. So what I do daily is a lot of, it can be very varied. Today, for example, we had a meeting this morning to discuss a lot of what I'm doing right now is related to this exhibit Facing Freedom, which opens soon. A meeting this morning about interactives related to the exhibit. The 4 stories for which I'm responsible is a good example. I've talked a little bit about the Japanese internment story. That's related to working with a local, the Chicago Japanese American Historical Society. One of the other stories for which I'm responsible is a story about the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota in 1973. That story, for example, has taken me up to do research in the Twin Cities. While I was up there, I met with the gentleman who was involved in this. A very typical thing I also do around Chicago is I met with him. He picked me up in his own vehicle. We drove around sites in the Twin Cities. I met a friend of his. That's often what I do is I will go into people's homes. I will meet them. I will learn about perhaps their own history, perhaps items that they want to donate to the museum, perhaps a story that we want to capture somehow. A normal day will also include a lot of writing. We have a blog that we're fairly active in, especially the curators here. Another post was about a an African-American basketball coach who broke some barriers in the mid-50s. He had recently passed away, and I wrote sort of a blog post / obituary from my perspective. So it's a lot of different things. One thing that it always is working with people. This branch of history is public history. And the idea is that your audience is a public audience. The opposite of public history is not private history, it's academic history. A public audience is very broad. This exhibit that we're working on now is primarily a 7th to 12th grade audience. That's where we're focusing on kids coming to our facility on field trips. So we get to think about delivering history and history products, so to speak,